It was just after 7 in the morning when Marcus Reed pulled into the small parking lot of Suncrest Diner, a quiet spot tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store on the edge of town. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue, and the street unusually still for a weekday. He was dressed in a plain grey sweatshirt, dark jeans, and running shoes, the kind of outfit that drew no attention. Or so he thought. Marcus had spent most of his adult life in uniform, but that morning he'd left his badge clipped to his wallet and his service weapon locked in the glove box. He wasn't here as Chief Reed of the neighboring county's police department. He was just a man stopping for coffee before a long day of reviewing reports. Inside the diner, the regulars were already settled. Truck drivers at the counter, retirees by the window, the waitress moving briskly between tables. Marcus gave her a polite nod and ordered his usual black coffee, oatmeal, and a side of toast. She smiled, recognizing him from past visits, and poured him a steaming mug before heading off to another table. It was an ordinary morning until the sound of raised voices drifted in from outside. 2 local officers were standing by a silver sedan. Across the street, lights flashing. A man pressed against the hood. Marcus glanced through the window, instinctively scanning the scene, the posture of the officers, the man's visible confusion. His training never really turned off, even on his days off. He sipped his coffee and turned away, but within seconds he heard the crunch of tires and the scrape of gravel. The officers had released the man and were crossing the street toward the diner, radios crackling. The bell over the door jingled as they entered. One of them, tall, early 30s, sharp jawline, scanned the room with quick eyes. The other was younger, restless, hand twitching near his belt. Marcus went back to his oatmeal, not paying them much attention. But then, from across the room, the younger officer's gaze fixed on him. "Sir," the officer called, "can we speak with you a second?" Marcus looked up, calm but cautious. "Is there a problem?" "Just a quick question," the taller officer said. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for. Mind stepping outside?" Marcus blinked slowly, setting down his spoon. "A suspect?" "Just procedure," the younger one said, already moving closer. "I'm sure it's a mistake," Marcus replied evenly, "but I'm happy to clear it up right here." "Outside, sir," the officer repeated, firmer this time. The diner had gone silent. The waitress froze behind the counter, eyes flicking nervously between them. Marcus exhaled, stood up slowly, and reached into his pocket for his wallet. "Let me just grab my ID. Hands where I can see them." The younger officer barked suddenly. Marcus paused, startled by the tone. His instincts kicked in. Stay calm, de-escalate, no sudden moves. "Officer," he said carefully, "I'm reaching for my identification." "Outside," the taller one said again, motioning toward the door. Marcus raised his hands slightly and walked toward the exit. The room watched in uneasy silence as he stepped outside into the morning light. The air was cooler now. The younger officer moved behind him, while the taller one circled to his side. "What's your name?" "Marcus Reed. You live around here?" "2 towns over." "What brings you here today?" "Coffee." The taller officer's brow furrowed. "You have any ID on you?" "In my wallet." "Back pocket. Go ahead," the taller one said. Marcus reached slowly, retrieving his wallet. Before he could open it, the younger officer suddenly grabbed his arm. "Don't move. Hey," Marcus said sharply, instinctively pulling back. That was all it took. The younger officer shoved him hard against the patrol car, twisting his wrist. Marcus's chest hit the hood, his balance gone. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Keep your hands where we can see them," the officer shouted. "I am keeping them where you can see them." Marcus tried to steady his voice, but years of training told him the situation had already slipped past reason. He could feel the adrenaline rush through his veins, his breath catching in disbelief. "Sir, stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Marcus said firmly. "I'm a law enforcement officer." "Yeah, sure," the younger cop scoffed, pushing harder on his arm. Something inside Marcus cracked, not from pain, but from disbelief. He'd spent his entire career teaching young officers how to identify and avoid exactly this. Rash decisions born of fear and ego. Now he was on the other side of it. "Look in my wallet," he said through clenched teeth. "Front slot." "There's a badge." The taller officer hesitated. "Wait, what did you say?" "My badge," Marcus repeated. "Chief Marcus Reed, County PD, look at my wallet." The taller one reached for it cautiously, flipped it open and froze. The polished shield glinted in the sunlight, the words Police Chief, Brookdale County etched clearly beneath his name. The silence that followed was suffocating. The younger officer released Marcus immediately, stumbling backward as color drained from his face. "Chief Reed?" Marcus turned slowly, rubbing his wrist. His eyes met the younger man's, sharp, level, unflinching. "That's right." The taller officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we didn't realize—" "No," Marcus said quietly. "You didn't." The diner door swung open behind them. The waitress stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide. A few onlookers had gathered at the edge of the sidewalk, murmuring. Marcus straightened, his voice calm but steady. "What was the call you were responding to?" The taller officer cleared his throat. "Report of a break-in suspect fitting your general description, sir." "Male, mid-40s, grey sweatshirt. And did dispatch give you a vehicle description?" No, sir." "So just a vague description and a hunch?" The younger officer's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at the ground. Marcus exhaled, forcing his shoulders to relax. "You're both lucky this ended the way it did." "Yes, sir," the taller one said quickly. Marcus nodded toward the patrol car. "I expect a full incident report by the end of the day. I'll be calling your chief personally." The younger officer's voice cracked. "Sir, please, it was an honest mistake." "An honest mistake," Marcus repeated, his voice low. "Could have gotten someone killed." For a long moment, no one spoke. The street was quiet, except for the hum of the patrol car's engine. Finally, Marcus turned back toward the diner. "You can keep the coffee," he told the waitress softly as he passed. "I think I've had enough for one morning." Inside his car, Marcus sat for several minutes before starting the engine. His pulse had steadied, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavy in his chest. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was exhaustion. He'd been on both sides of the badge. He knew what fear could do, how split-second decisions could warp perception. But he also knew what discipline, respect, and accountability looked like. And what he just witnessed wasn't any of those things. As he drove away, the reflection of the flashing lights faded in his rearview mirror. He didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just quiet, resolved. There would be conversations to have, reports to file, and lessons to teach, because if those two officers could make that mistake with him, what did that mean for everyone else who didn't have a badge to pull from their wallet? The sun was rising higher now, spilling gold across the road ahead. Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind already moving through the steps he'd take next. He wouldn't yell and he wouldn't shame them. He'd do what good leaders did, turn the moment into a mirror and make them look into it until they saw what he saw. The next day, sunlight cut across Marcus Reed's office window, glinting off the brass lettering on his door that read, "Chief of Police, Brookdale County." He sat behind his desk, hands clasped, staring at the morning briefing folder he hadn't yet opened. The events from the diner replayed in his mind in quiet, frustrating loops. He had seen many versions of that moment in his career, moments when training faltered and bias filled the gaps. But being on the receiving end had left a mark that no report could quite capture. It wasn't just humiliation, it was disappointment. He had built his career on principles of fairness, restraint, and respect. And now two officers from a neighboring jurisdiction had nearly undone that with a single rash decision. A soft knock came at the door. "Chief, it's open." Marcus looked up. His deputy, Lieutenant Sandra Pierce, stood in the doorway holding a cup of coffee. She was sharp, steady, and one of the few people he trusted without reservation. "Morning, Sandra," he said quietly. She stepped in, closing the door behind her. "You all right? Heard something happened in Suncrest yesterday," he sighed. "Word travels fast." "Fast enough that I've had 2 calls already," she said, setting the coffee on his desk. "You want to tell me what really happened, before rumors make it worse." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Stopped at the diner before heading here. 2 patrol officers came in, said I matched the description of a suspect. Before I could reach for my ID, one of them decided to play hero. Next thing I know, I'm face down on a cruiser." Sandra's eyebrows rose. "You're joking." "Wish I was." She let out a slow breath. "Did they know who you were?" "Not until I showed my badge," he said flatly. "Then suddenly I was everyone's sir." Sandra shook her head, pacing once before sitting down across from him. "That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. I'm not interested in suing anyone, Marcus said, but I am interested in making sure it doesn't happen again. Suncrest PD, she asked. He nodded. Two of their younger officers, new hires by the looks of it. Nervous, inexperienced, and armed with too much confidence, Sandra tilted her head. What do you want to do about it? Marcus stared out the window, watching a patrol car pull into the lot below. I'm calling their chief this morning. We'll handle it professionally. But I want them in a training session by next week, here with our department. Sandra smiled faintly. They're turning it into a teaching moment. Always, he said. Anger doesn't fix behavior. Experience does. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in the small conference room across from Chief Paul Mallory, the head of Suncrest PD. Mallory was a seasoned officer in his early 50s, his face weathered by years of long shifts and hard lessons. Marcus, Mallory said, shaking his head, I'm still wrapping my head around it. My guys told me what happened, and I couldn't believe it. You have every right to be furious. I'm not furious, Marcus said. Just tired. Mallory exhaled, nodding. I'm embarrassed, to be honest. They're both good kids, but this was reckless. They acted on fear, not fact. Marcus folded his hands. Fear doesn't excuse negligence. If that's how they respond to uncertainty, then they need retraining, and fast. Mallory nodded quickly. Agreed. I've already put them on administrative review. I'd appreciate it if you'd sit in on the evaluation. I will, Marcus said. And I'd also like to speak to them personally, not as punishment but as perspective. Mallory looked surprised. You'd actually talk to them? Marcus nodded. I've spent 25 years teaching young officers how to think before they act. This is another chance to do that. The following morning, the two Suncrest officers arrived at the Brookdale precinct. Both looked uneasy in their pressed uniforms. Marcus greeted them calmly in the training room. Gentlemen, he said, motioning for them to sit. You know who I am now. But yesterday you didn't. That's what we're here to talk about. The younger officer, the same one who'd pinned him, shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I want to say up front I'm sorry. I should have listened when you said you were reaching for ID. Marcus nodded. You should have. But tell me, what made you act the way you did? The officer hesitated. We had a call about a break-in. Dispatch said male, mid-40s, grey hoodie, dark jeans. When we saw you, I just reacted. Why? Marcus asked evenly. He swallowed. I don't know. You matched the description and the officer's voice dropped. And I was nervous. I didn't want to make a mistake. Marcus leaned forward slightly. So you made one anyway. The young man's face tightened, shame flickering behind his eyes. Marcus's tone stayed calm, never cruel. I've been where you are. I've made mistakes too. The difference between a bad officer and a good one isn't perfection. It's reflection. What you did wasn't about training. It was about perception. You saw someone who fit a vague profile, and your mind filled in the blanks before your facts did. The taller officer, sitting beside his partner, spoke up. Sir, we never meant any disrespect. Marcus shook his head. I don't need an apology for disrespect. I need an understanding of what that moment means. Because the next time it might not be me. It might be someone who doesn't have a badge to pull out of their wallet. And then what? Silence filled the room. After a moment, Marcus stood and walked to the whiteboard behind him. He picked up a marker and wrote in bold letters, Fear plus assumption. Damage. Then beneath it, pause plus assess. Safety. He turned back to them. Every time you step out of that patrol car, you bring power with you. Power can protect or it can destroy. Which one it becomes depends entirely on your discipline in those 3 seconds between impulse and action. The younger officer nodded slowly, his eyes down. You're right, Chief, I messed up. Marcus crossed his arms. Then don't waste the lesson. Learn from it. And when you're the one training rookies someday, remember what it felt like to be here right now, and make sure they never repeat it. After the meeting, as the two officers left, Chief Mallory lingered behind. You handled that better than I ever could have, he said quietly. I would have been furious, Marcus gave a faint smile. I've been furious before. It doesn't teach as much as you think. Mallory nodded. You'll probably change the way those two see the badge. I hope so, Marcus said. That's how the system gets better. One officer, one conversation, one mirror at a time. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Marcus drove home past the same diner where it had all happened. The parking lot was half empty, the neon sign flickering. He parked for a moment, watching through the window. The waitress who'd seen everything that morning was wiping down tables. For a moment he considered going in, maybe for a coffee, maybe to thank her for staying calm. But instead he stayed in the car, resting his hands on the steering wheel. He didn't need the coffee. What he needed was time, to think, to breathe, to remember why he'd joined the force in the first place. Not for control, not for authority, but for integrity, the kind that keeps a person steady when everything around them is shaking. As the sun disappeared behind the line of buildings, Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new reports, new calls, but tonight he felt something different. Not bitterness, not anger, just resolve. Because sometimes justice wasn't about who was right or wrong. Sometimes it was about who was willing to keep the mirror steady long enough for everyone to finally see themselves clearly. A week passed, and though the incident had officially been logged, it hadn't left Marcus's mind, or the minds of anyone in either department. Word had spread quickly through the small network of local law enforcement, and while most officers spoke about it quietly, the undertone was always the same: embarrassment, disbelief, reflection. Marcus had been in enough precincts to know that change didn't happen through punishment. It happened through conversation, through the long, uncomfortable process of looking at yourself honestly. So when Chief Mallory called and asked if Marcus would speak to Suncrest's entire department during their upcoming joint training day, Marcus agreed immediately. On the morning of the session, he arrived early. The training hall was a converted gym inside the municipal building, rows of metal chairs lined up facing a whiteboard, a projector flickering quietly at the front. A few officers sat in small groups chatting softly. Most avoided his gaze when he entered. "Morning, Chief," Mallory greeted, shaking his hand. "I appreciate you doing this." "No problem," Marcus said. "They need to hear this, and I'd rather it come from someone who understands both sides of it." By the time the session began, nearly every officer in the department was seated. The two who had detained him sat near the back, their faces drawn and serious. Mallory stepped forward first. "All right, everyone. I won't waste time explaining why we're here. You've all heard what happened. Chief Reed has graciously offered to speak with us, not to assign blame, but to help us learn." He nodded toward Marcus. "Chief." Marcus stood, his presence quiet but commanding. He didn't start with introductions. Everyone already knew who he was. Instead, he looked around the room for a long moment before speaking. "Let me start with this," he said evenly. "No one here wakes up planning to do harm. You put on your uniform to protect, to serve. But what happened last week wasn't about bad people. It was about what happens when fear gets ahead of judgment." The room was silent. "I've been on the force for 25 years, Marcus continued. "I've seen good officers make bad calls. I've seen communities lose trust over one mistake. What happened at that diner wasn't the worst mistake I've seen, but it's one that should never happen." He paused, letting the words settle. "When those two officers approached me, I didn't see hate. I saw uncertainty. And uncertainty without discipline becomes danger. You all carry power every single day, power that can either keep peace or destroy it in a heartbeat." A few officers shifted in their seats, listening closely. Marcus stepped closer to the front row. "Ask yourselves this. What made those officers see me as a threat first and a person second? It wasn't the call. It wasn't the clothes. It was instinct shaped by experience, by the quiet messages that build up over years about who looks suspicious." He let that hang for a moment. That instinct doesn't make you evil, but it does make you responsible for checking it. Because unchecked instinct in this job gets people hurt. A hand went up in the second row. It was an older officer, grey hair at his temples, his voice careful. "Chief, I've been on the job nearly as long as you have. I've seen situations turn bad fast. Sometimes hesitation costs lives." Marcus nodded. "You're absolutely right. But hesitation and assessment aren't the same thing. What saves lives is composure. When you stop to think for 1 second longer, when you ask one more question before you act, that's not weakness. It's control. That's the difference between force and authority." Another hand rose. this time from the younger of the two officers involved in the diner incident. His voice was quiet, uneasy. "Sir, I don't know if I'll ever live that day down. Everyone keeps looking at me like I'm the example of what not to be." Marcus looked at him steadily. "You are the example of what can happen and of what can change. What matters is what you do next. You learned something most officers take years to understand. The badge doesn't make you right. It gives you responsibility. Use it better next time." The young man nodded, his jaw tight. Gratitude hidden under the weight of regret. For the next hour, Marcus led them through practical exercises, reviewing footage of traffic stops, discussing tone, posture, and de-escalation. He asked them to analyze their own reactions, to notice when their shoulders stiffened, when their voices rose, when fear began to mask itself as confidence. At the end, he drew 2 circles on the whiteboard, one labeled power, the other respect. "You can have one without the other," he said, pointing between them. "But only one lasts. Power ends when the badge comes off. Respect doesn't. If you want people to trust you, they have to believe you see them as human first." When the session ended, the officers filed out quietly, thoughtful. A few stopped to shake his hand. One older sergeant said simply, "That was the first time training felt real." When the room finally emptied, Chief Mallory walked up, shaking his head. "I did what I couldn't. You made them listen." Marcus smiled faintly. "They didn't listen to me. They listened to the truth. I just gave it a voice." As Marcus left the building, the afternoon light spilled across the street. He paused near his car, looking down the road that led back toward Brookdale. It was quiet, the kind of peace that came not from silence but from understanding. He thought of all the lessons he'd learned over the years, all the times he'd seen good officers undone by moments of panic. And he knew this. Every generation of police needed someone to remind them that control wasn't about who had the gun. It was about who had the grace to think before using it. Later that evening, back in his office, Marcus found a letter sitting on his desk. No name, just an envelope sealed with shaky handwriting. Inside was a short note. "Chief Reed, I was one of the officers from Suncrest. I wanted to say thank you. You could have humiliated us, but instead you taught us. I'll never forget that. I promise to do better." Officer D. Marcus read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't smile, but his shoulders eased. Sometimes leadership wasn't about fixing everything. Sometimes it was about planting something that would grow long after you left the room. That night, as he drove home under a wash of fading sunlight, Marcus felt something he hadn't in days. Not relief, but quiet conviction. He had turned anger into lesson, humiliation into purpose, and maybe that was what justice really looked like. Not loud, not vengeful, but steady. A mirror held up long enough for everyone to finally see what was standing on both sides of the badge. 2 weeks later, the ripple of what had happened in Suncrest was still moving quietly through the departments in the region. What had started as a mistake, a pair of rash decisions outside a diner, had grown into a lesson officers couldn't stop talking about. The training Marcus led had spread further than he expected. Chiefs from nearby precincts began reaching out, asking if he'd repeat the session for their officers. Some wanted it for new recruits, others for veterans who had grown too comfortable. It wasn't official policy yet, but the conversations it started mattered more than any memo or press release ever could. Marcus wasn't trying to build a name or make headlines. He just wanted the culture to shift. One quiet conversation, one reflection at a time. That Friday morning, he arrived early at Brookdale headquarters. The sun was just rising, light spilling across the flag outside the precinct. He parked in his usual spot, coffee in hand, and stood for a moment beside his car, letting the cool air steady his thoughts. Inside, the hallways buzzed softly with morning chatter, radios crackling, phones ringing, the rhythm of another workday beginning. He walked into his office to find Lieutenant Sandra Pierce waiting by his desk with her tablet in hand. "Morning, Chief," she said. "You might want to see this." Marcus set his coffee down. "What is it?" She turned the tablet toward him. It was a local news article. The headline read, "Police Chief Turns Own Detainment into Statewide Training Reform." He frowned slightly, scrolling through it. The story summarized the incident at the diner, the training he'd led, and the impact it was already having across several counties. The photo showed him in the training hall, standing before the whiteboard with the words, fear plus assumption, damage written behind him. Sandra smiled. "You're officially a role model, Chief." He sighed softly. "That's not what I wanted." "I know," she said. "But it's what people needed. Departments are talking about real reflection for once, not just checking boxes." "That's because of you." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I just reminded them what the job is supposed to mean." Sandra nodded. "Sometimes reminding people is the hardest part." Later that afternoon, Marcus drove to Suncrest for a follow-up meeting with Chief Mallory. They were planning a regional conference, not a PR event, but a joint seminar for officers from multiple towns. The goal was simple: rebuild trust one department at a time. When he arrived, the small-town station looked different from the last time he'd been there. The energy felt lighter. Officers greeted him with quiet respect as he walked in. In the break room, Mallory poured 2 cups of coffee. "You'd think we brought in a motivational speaker," he said with a grin. "The shift in morale has been..." "Something," Marcus chuckled. "Small changes start big ones." Mallory's expression softened. "You know, that young officer, Daniels, he hasn't been the same since the training. Not in a bad way. He's calmer, more measured. A few days ago, he handled a call with a guy having a breakdown downtown. Could have gone south fast. Instead, he diffused it without ever drawing his weapon. Later, he told me he just kept hearing your voice in his head. Pause, assess, act." Marcus smiled quietly, setting down his cup. "That's good to hear." Mallory looked thoughtful. "You turned something ugly into something meaningful, Marcus. Not everyone could have done that." Marcus shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about what's possible when you stop defending mistakes and start learning from them." As the afternoon light dimmed, Marcus stepped outside the station and leaned against his car, watching as a patrol car pulled out onto the main road. For the first time in a while, he felt a sense of peace about what had happened. The diner, the moment on the pavement, the sting of it, all of it had become part of something larger than his own frustration. He thought of his father, a sheriff back in the old days, a man who used to say, "Badges don't make men better. They just make their choices louder." Marcus had carried that lesson for years, but now it meant more than ever. That night, he stopped at the same diner for the first time since the incident. The same waitress was behind the counter. When she saw him, her eyes widened with recognition. "Morning, Chief," she said, smiling nervously. "Or I guess it's evening now." "Good to see you again," he smiled back. "Good to see you too." She hesitated before asking, "Everything worked out okay?" Marcus nodded. "Better than I expected." She poured him a cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. "I tell people about that day sometimes, about how fast things can turn, and how you stayed calm through it. Guess you turned it into something good." Marcus chuckled softly, trying to. "One cup of coffee at a time." When he finished his drink, he left a tip and stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street. The same kind of morning light from that day, golden, ordinary, and peaceful, washed over the sidewalk. As he stepped outside, a patrol car passed by, its lights off, its driver offering him a respectful nod. Marcus nodded back. It struck him how strange it was, how the same town, the same street, could hold both humiliation and healing depending on how you faced it. He walked to his car, the air cool and clear, and paused before getting in. He didn't see himself as a victim or a hero, just a man doing his job, trying to make the uniform mean what it was supposed to again. And as he drove away from the diner, the lights fading in his rearview mirror, he thought about what he'd tell the next group of recruits he trained. The badge doesn't protect your ego. It protects your integrity. Don't forget which one matters. The words sat in his mind like a quiet promise, one he intended to keep, one that might outlast even his years of service.